Recording. And yeah, it's been a wild couple weeks. I had classes prepared each of the past 2 weeks, and then life got in the way and wasn't able to make it. So hopefully we'll have an opportunity to study some of that material as
We brought up
well.
your
But
range if you'd like.
I'm not going
but let me share the source sheet, and we're gonna today
Oh, that's important too.
look at a more of a halachic topic than a parshanut topic. And that's we find at the end of the parsha, of course, Parsha Beshalach begins with the nation having been sent away and Paro and the Egyptians chasing after them, the Shirat Hayam, the song at the sea, Az Yashir. And then we come to Mara, and there's a lot of, there's some complaining going on. The miracles that the Jewish people witness don't seem to have a lasting impact. And among the miracles that we read, it's actually interesting the way it gets presented. But we have the Parshat Haman, the chapter of Man, the manna. And there's actually a Kabbalistic tradition of reading this parsha. It's supposed to be a segula, some sort of blessing for parnasa, for earning a livelihood. And many have the practice this week on Erev Shabbos to put bread outside for the birds to eat. That seems to be related to the fact that the birds would every day eat any extra man that was out. So there's many that have that practice. And so I wanted to look, though, at a specific component of the man, which has much impact on our practice today on Shabbos. And that's the idea of Lechem Mishneh, right? Which I'm just gonna use the phrase Lechem Mishneh. I'm not gonna translate it every time. What does Lechem Mishneh mean?
Double portion.
A double portion, or literally double bread, right? So that's the source of having two challahs at the Shabbos meal. So we're going to start in chapter 16. Someone please tell me when I need to scroll down in the English again.
Might as well do it now.
It's nice and big and easy to read.
I already zoomed in. I know my audience. Vayomer Hashem el Moshe, Hineni mamtir lachem lechem min hashamayim, v'yatza ha'am v'laktu devar yom biyomo, l'man anasenu hayelech b'torati imo. God says to Moshe, I am going to rain down for you from the sky bread, and the nation will go out and gather every day in order that I can test them if they will follow my Torah or not. And I think in a previous year, we looked at the Nisayon, the test that is the man. V'haya bayom hashishi v'hechinu asher yaviu v'haya mishneh al asher liktu yom yom. On the sixth day, on Friday, they will prepare whatever they bring in, and it will be double over that which they gather day to day.
Oh, there's Cheryl.
And so then we continue, and we're going to skip a couple of psukim. We're going to go down to let's go to verse 14. Vatal shichvatatal. V'hinei al pnei hamidbar dak mechuspas dak kafkor al haaretz. I chose the one that's the hardest to translate. When the fall of dew lifted there over the morning, there the surface of the wilderness lay a fine and flaky substance, as fine as frost on the ground. Remember, they're in the desert, so we don't normally see frost on the ground in the desert. Vayeru bnei Yisrael vayomru ish el achiv manhu. So the Jewish people see it and they ask each other, what is this? Kilo yadu mahu, because they didn't know what it was. Right? So man is probably just a different congregate of ma, the word what. So they ask, what is it? Moshe says, this is the bread that God is giving you to eat. Zehadavar asher tiva Hashem Biktu mimenu ish lefi ochlo, omer lagobolet mispar nafshotechem, ish lasher bo'alo tikachu. This is what God commanded. You shall each gather an omer, which is a measurement, 1 omer per person in the household. For every person in the home, you shall gather. And so this is what they did. They took exactly as they were told to take. Moshe says, don't leave any of it over till the next day. Not everyone listened. They left over, some people left over some of the man until the morning, and it rotted, and there were worms, and Moshe got angry at them. They would gather it every morning, each person according to what they needed to eat, and then it would melt in the heat of the sun. This is our key verse. Vayhi bayom hashishi, laktu lechem mishneh, shnei haomer la'echad, vayavo kol nisiyei ha'ida v'yagidu l'Moshe. On the 6th day, they gathered double portion, and all of the leaders of the tribes came and they told Moshe. Vayomer alehem, hu asher diber Hashem, Shabbaton Shabbat, Kodesh LaHashem, Machar, et asher tofu te'ifu, et asher tevashlu bashilu, et kol ha'odif hanichu lachem l'mishmeret ad boker. Moshe says, yes. This is what God commanded, or this is what God said. It is a resting day for Hashem. A holy day is tomorrow. So therefore, bake whatever you're going to bake, cook whatever you're going to cook. And whatever is left over, leave until the morning.
So shall you reap.
They leave it over, and now, today, it doesn't rot, and there were no worms. Moshe says, eat it today, because today is Shabbat. You will not find the man in the field. For 6 days you shall gather it, but on the 7th day there will be no man. All right, so what's going on with the double portion of the man?
It's for Shabbos.
Say again?
It's for Shabbos.
It's for Shabbos. It's for Shabbos. How do they discover this need for taking a double portion?
And Moshe told them, right?
He was supposed to tell him, but he didn't.
So that's a good question. Did Moshe tell them or not?
No.
Right, let's go back in verse 22. On the 6th day, they gathered double the amount of food, 2 omers for each. And when all the chieftains came from the community and told Moshe, he said to them, this is what Hashem meant. Tomorrow's a day of rest, a holy Sabbath. Bake what you would bake, boil what you would boil. All that is left put aside to be kept until morning. Did they gather it at Moshe's command? It's very unclear. It seems like they gathered it, and then the chiefs of the tribes get word that they took extra, and they go and report it to Moshe. So how did the people know to take extra?
They thought about it, let's say, and decided that if they were aware that there was to be no cooking, no gathering on Shabbos, they made a decision. We should, it's like you're going to have more guests or whatever. Shop first, and then hopefully you'll have enough. And the shopping is they went out and they collected, just in case.
Okay, so that's what I always assumed was the case. I always assumed that was the case, that they know it's Shabbos and that there's laws associated with food preparation on Shabbos. So therefore, they kind of knew that they couldn't gather it. But where in the Torah do they see that?
Well, they started to learn about Shabbos at Mara before
Right.
then. So,
Right.
but the Rebbe tries to give them a pass a little bit on it by saying that they didn't think all of this was really going to be binding until they got to Har Sinai. So
Okay.
they were still kind of we're kind of learning about this mode, except that they were very hungry, so that kind of, they needed the food.
So there's a fascinating Rashbam. The Rashbam, Rashi's grandson, says as follows. Vayomer Alehem hu asher diber Hashem. Right. So Moshe replies to the chieftains of the tribes, and he says, "This is what God means." Miyom harishon vani lo higadati lachem. This is what God said on the first day, meaning when we were first given this idea of man, we were given this commandment to gather double on Friday. Umoshe nitkavin sheyu tmihim k'sheyimtzeu mishneh lo'odia lahem atak kvodo shel yom haShabbat. Moshe intentionally withheld this information from them. Moshe didn't tell them about Shabbos. Didn't tell them about the need to collect double, in order that this would be kind of like his hook to teach them about Shabbos. According to the Rashbam and also to Rashi, let's just go back to Rashi for a second. I skipped over it by mistake. Rashi says, Mishneh, in source number 2, double. Also, you regilim liokot yom yom shel shar yomot hashavua. It was double over that which they normally collected every other day. Omerani asher yaviu v'haya mishneh. So Rashi reads it, that which they brought was doubled. Lachar sheyaviu yimseu mishneh b'mitida al asher yukatu v'yamodu yom yom. Meaning they gathered the normal amount. They go out to the field, to the desert, wherever this man fell, and they took the same omer that they took every day. Then they go home, and lo and behold, the one omer of food had become 2.
That's a strange issue.
So that's what the Rashbam is assuming also. The Rashbam assumes that they didn't actually collect a double portion, but that at some point a double portion materialized in their homes. And that this was Moshe's way of trying to teach them about the laws of Shabbos. Which is a really interesting idea. So first of all, right, it raises the question about, well, why did Moshe not, it's nice that Moshe wants to teach them in this surprising way, but he risks them violating Shabbos by doing so, right? And why, if they were given Shabbos at a much earlier point, it doesn't make sense that Moshe would withhold the information from them. Interestingly, if we go back, not everyone agrees with this understanding. Rashi has an alternative explanation. The first is that, again, they collected just the normal amount, and at some point it miraculously doubled on its own. But then in number 3, Rashi says, Umidrash agada, lechem mishneh. Don't read it as mishneh, but read it as the word mishuneh, which means different or distinguished. On Friday, it was of a different quality than it was on other days. It smelled better, it tasted better, right? There's all sorts of midrashim we all know about the man, that, right, whatever you wanted it to taste like, it tasted like. The Torah tells us it tasted like dough fried in honey. So Rashi quotes a medrash that says, during the week, it was, whatever you serve on a Tuesday night dinner, it was salmon or pasta or whatever. And then when it came to Shabbos, it smelled and it tasted like chicken and potato kugel or cholent or whatever else, right? That it tasted different. And so that's another really interesting, it's a really interesting understanding of what this Lechem Mishnah is. Right, and Rashi, just like the Rashbam, or chronology, it's the Rashbam, just like Rashi, continuing there. They asked Moshe, why is today, is it different than any other day? So this infers that Moshe had not yet taught them about the laws of Shabbos, which he was commanded to teach them. V'haya bayom hashishi ve'echinu asher yaviu, right? He was already told on the sixth day they should prepare whatever they're going to bring. Ad sheshalu mazot, until they asked him about it. And so, just like the Rashbam is following in his grandfather's footsteps, that Moshe withheld the information in order that they would ask about it, and that would be his way of introducing Shabbos to them. And if that's the case, so not only do we have this interesting pedagogical move, we also see that Lechem Mishneh becomes the, I don't want to say the most important, but it becomes the opening detail, right? The rule on which all of Hilchot Shabbos is introduced to the Jewish people, which is a little interesting.
Yeah.
Why should this be that? Why should this be the most driving, most important, or that first introduction to Shabbos? Right, when we're trying to convince people to experience what Shabbos is like, the selling point isn't normally, well, you get a second loaf of challah. Like that's not usually the selling point of Shabbos, right?
But somebody who's working and is struggling to make enough food on a daily, to make enough money to buy enough food on a daily basis, there's a lot of pressure to continue to provide. And so that it becomes a phenomenon. It was very common in the immigrant communities. People who were traditionally Shabbos observant back in Europe, they're stuck in America where they're told, you don't show up on Saturday, don't come back on Monday, you lose your job. And they would try to keep their families
right.
fed, but keeping tradition. There was something in the who, what, when. There's a member of the general Jewish community here in Baltimore, a very lovely guy, who's announced that he's going on Aliyah. And one of the things that he remembers from his childhood that he recalls is his parents operating a grocery store and making sure that a neighbor off of Green Spring Avenue would collect him on Friday afternoon, evening, to go to shul.
Uh-huh.
And to make sure that he was in shul Friday evening and presumably Saturday morning until they were able to stop not being at home
Right.
at those times.
Right.
And that made an impression on the child who grew up to be a very fine person.
Yeah. I mean, like for sure, Shabbos observance and both. I could see how a selling point is we have great meals on Shabbos and the food is delicious and we don't worry about anything else. And balancing that with the financial pressures of how do you pay for such nice meals or extra meals is all very important. But I'm just saying, it's just curious that according to this approach, it is through Lechem Mishneh that the laws of Shabbos get introduced to the Jewish people. And yeah, we've all heard stories of the challenges, that and the lengths that Jews have gone through to keep Shabbos, or have not successfully been able to keep Shabbos because of pressures from the world around them, and not to take away from any of that. So I wanted to go a little bit into some of the details and discussions of this idea of Lechem Mishneh.
You're not doing this, you're not.
Okay, so we're going to go to source number 6, which is the Gemara in Shabbos. Amar Rabbi Abba, Shabbat chayav adam liftsoa al shtei kikarot. On Shabbos, a person must. It's interesting. The verb liftsoa, batsa, means both to bless and to break bread. So it's a little bit unclear, right? Does it mean that you're supposed to say a blessing over 2 loaves, or that you're supposed to break 2 loaves of bread? Dichtiv lechem mishnah, as it says, double bread. Amar Rav Ashi, chazina leila Rav Kahana denakat tarte uvatzachada. So Rav Ashi says that Rav Kahana would take 2 loaves and he would break one of them. Amar liktu kativ. Because the only time the Torah specifies double is with the verb of liktu, of taking the bread. But there's no requirement, according to this, to actually break both loaves of bread, to actually cut them and distribute them. Rabbi Zera hava batza akula sherute. Rabbi Zera, when he would sit down for a Shabbos meal, he would break off a huge chunk of bread so that it was, it was enough for the entire meal. Amar le Ravina le Rav Ashi v'ha mechse karav tunatana. If he does that, he looks like he's a glutton. Why is he taking such a huge piece of bread at the beginning of the meal? Amar le kevan dechol yom lo avid va'ina hu dika avid lo mechse karav tunata. Nope, since every other day of the week he just takes a normal size, he takes a normal chunk of bread off. So he's not considered a glutton. It's clear that he's doing this special for Shabbos, not because he's an uncivilized glutton in any way.
Next page.
With Ami Rav Asi, Ki mikla lahu rifta de eruva sharu eluye. So if they would encounter bread that was used for an eruv, right? We think of an eruv as the wire around town that allows us to carry, but there's actually multiple types of eruvin, and not only does it require the bread or the wire or the way to legally categorize an area as a Reshut HaYachid, a private domain, but it also requires that everyone who is participating and benefiting from it have a symbolic bread that belongs to that group of individuals. So, Rav Heinemann every year will set aside a bread. Usually it's a box of matzah because it doesn't go stale, but he'll set it aside every year. There's a bracha that's said in order to create the eruv. So if they would somehow encounter a bread that was, and there's also bread that's used in creating of eruv tchumin, if someone had to set up, wants to travel beyond 2,000 amot, then you could set out meals and bread along the way, and then that extends your reach where you can go, and also specifically to people that live in courtyards or shared public spaces. So if they would encounter any of this eruv bread, they'd say, well, since one mitzvah was done on it, we'll also use that bread for our Lechem Mishneh. So that raises the question, what is the status of Lechem Mishneh? Right? Is it a biblical requirement to have these 2 loaves of bread at your Shabbos meal, or is it something less than that? Is someone typing?
Somebody has their mic on or something. It's just very annoying.
Yeah. All right. I think I silenced them. Okay. Okay. So what is the status of this Lechem Mishneh? The Shulchan Aruch in source number 8 tells us, Botseya al shtei kikarot shleimot shochei shtehen biyado botseya hatachtona. You should say the blessing over 2 loaves, 2 whole loaves, which means that you hold them both in your hand, and you should break the I'll say break, but distribute or eat from the bottom one. And the Ramah adds, Dafka b'leil Shabbos, aval b'yom HaShabbat o b'leil Yom Tov botin al ha'elyona. Says that specifically on Friday night that you should make the blessing, or you should eat from and distribute the bottom loaf, but during the day or on Yontif, you should use the top loaf. Hatam hu al derech HaKabbalah. The reason for this is all Kabbalistic. I do not understand the Kabbalah involved in why sometimes we use the bottom loaf and sometimes the top loaf. In all honesty, I didn't spend much time delving into it either. So if but anyway, there is that discussion as well about, well, once you have 2 loaves, which one are you supposed to use? Mitzvah libotzea b'Shabbos prusa gdola shetaspik lo l'chol ha'seuda, and it's also a mitzvah, he says, right? The second opinion in the Gemara, to break off a large piece of bread that will suffice for the entire meal. I don't think they were cutting their challah with fancy challah knives back when this was written. I think they were just tearing it apart. Mishnah Berurah tells us, Shtei kikarot zecher leman yichtiv liktu lechem Mishneh. Right. So the reason we do that is to remember the man, as it says, take double bread. Gam b'Yom Tov tzarich livtzoal shtei kikarot, and also on Yom Tov you have to take two loaves. We're going to get into the question of whether if women are included in this obligation or not. So we'll skip over this line in the Mishnah Berurah for now. We'll go down to number 2, shleimot, whole bread. Uga shenisrafa kitzat v'adayin lo nechtach mimena yesh omim deyotzin bo le'inyan lechem Mishnah. Right? What if one of the loaves is burnt? But it's part of it is burnt, but it's still a whole loaf. You haven't cut off the defected part. So there's those who say that this would still work for your requirement for Lechem Mishneh. I am Bashari Tshuva. Im ein lo pat shlema. If you don't have whole loaves, eino me'akev. It doesn't prevent you from fulfilling, from making the blessing. V'yachol lekadesh afilu al kizayit pat. You can say kiddush or make your meal even if all you have is an olive size worth of bread. V'nachon linhog shezehu shebotzeh yichrach liftor yichavein liftor bebirkat hamotzi kol mesubim. V'gam yomar lemasubim sheyichavunu latzeit bebirchato kedei shekulam yitzu belechem Mishneh. Right, the proper way to do it is that one person should make a blessing over 2 loaves of bread, and he should have in mind, or they should have in mind, that everyone around the table is fulfilling their obligation, and that they should have in mind that the one making the blessing is fulfilling the obligation for them. So that way, everyone fulfills the requirement of Lechem Mishneh. According to the Mishnah Berurah, do you think it's this is like a requirement? What level would you give this Lechem Mishneh based on the Mishnah Berurah?
It's a higher level of elegance.
Okay, it's a higher level, but it's not
practice.
Preferred practice. But right, it's not. It doesn't. Right, he says if you don't have it, then you can say it even on just an olive size of bread. So it doesn't seem like from the Mishnah Berurah that this is such a huge, strong requirement. But if we look at the Taz, so the Taz is actually talking. This is in number 10. He's in Hilchot Chanukah. He's in the laws of Chanukah. So there's a very famous Gemara that says if you have a choice between buying Shabbos candles and Chanukah candles, right? How do you prioritize? So in that discussion of prioritization, he says, Hapat de Lechem Mishneh, hu kodem leyayin kiddush. If you have only enough money to buy either 2 loaves of bread for Lechem Mishneh on Shabbos or for wine to say kiddush, then the bread takes precedence, takes priority. The ha Lechem Mishneh lechule alma de oraita. Because everyone agrees that Lechem Mishneh is a biblical requirement. Okay, so he brings a proof from the Gemara, and he says that having 3 meals on Shabbos is also biblically required, and you need bread, and bread, right? If you don't have wine, you can say kiddush over wine. But according to the Taz, Lechem Mishneh is a biblical requirement. The Aruch HaShulchan says similarly, V'nira shezehu din Torah, v'lo asmachta be'alma. The requirement for Lechem Mishneh is a Torah requirement, and not merely an allusion in the verses. But the Magen Avraham says, right, he's talking in the context of another interesting halachic case we're not going to get into. But he says at the very end, right, if someone leaves bread in the, something cooking in the oven when Shabbos begins, was it done in a permissible way and a not permissible way? But anyway, he says in his discussion, Im yesh lo pat achar mazon gimel seudot asor latzio. Afal gav titzarich lechol seuda kikar shalim velechem mishnah. Right? If you have enough bread already, you have enough bread for 3 meals, even if it's not a whole loaf, and even if it's not 2 loaves per meal. If you have enough bread to eat, he says you don't need to, you're not allowed to take from the oven anything that was problematically put in the oven before Shabbos, in order to fulfill the requirement of Lechem Mishneh, because Lechem Mishneh is not such a strong requirement. So we have this debate whether Lechem Mishneh is a deoraita or derabanan. We have significant sources, the Taz and the Aruch HaShulchan, that say it is biblically mandated, and therefore at every meal we need to have this 2 loaf requirement. And then the Magen Avraham and perhaps the Mishnah Berurah are not as concerned about it. They still agree it's a proper thing to do, but if you don't have it, or you don't have to go crazy chasing after it, you can just proceed with whatever it is that you do have. All right, there are interesting questions about how you define a whole loaf of bread, right? So that comes up. It comes up in discussion of tearaway challahs, pull apart challahs, right? So is that considered 1 loaf or multiple loaves? Or even more interesting of a question is what about you go to 7 Mile and Rosendorf's has 6 rolls in a bag and they're all sort of stuck together, right? Clearly they were baked together or they became attached in the oven. Is that considered 1 loaf of bread or is that considered multiple? So one test is the Magen Avraham later on says if you could pick it up and it remains intact, so then that would be considered 1 whole loaf. So generally a pull apart challah, even if you hold it, it will stay connected until you do a physical thing to tear it. But the rolls that are sold as a package of 6 or 12 loaves, even though they're stuck together, it's not they're not so strongly stuck together. So everyone, and certainly if they were intended to be sold as separate rolls, almost everyone universally agrees that would be considered separate loaves for Lechem Mishneh. But if it's something like a pull apart challah, that's really considered 1. And if you were to break it, you would wouldn't consider the small piece you broke off to be a whole loaf. So that wouldn't work for that would only be 1. You need something else in addition to get to Lechem Mishneh. Okay, the interesting question about whether this applies to women or not. So first of all, what's the question? Why would we think it doesn't apply to women?
Do women have to partake of Lechem Mishneh?
Right. So that's the question. Do they have to partake of it? And the question is, why would we think they don't? So, because generally women are exempt from mitzvah aseh zman grama, from positive time-bound commandments. So since we have a requirement, right, to eat 3 meals on Shabbos, it's in a very specific time frame that would seem to fall into a positive time-bound commandment. The Beit Yosef in source number 17, however, gives us the lumdus, the rationale why this assumption is wrong. So number 1, he says, Katvu Haran v'Hamordechai v'Shem Rabbeinu Tam. So the first position is that of Rabbeinu Tam from the Bali Tosfot. Dinashim chayavot begimel seudot v'chein nami livtsoa al shtei kikarot. Rabbeinu Tam holds that women are obligated to eat 3 meals on Shabbos, and also that they're obligated in Lechem Mishneh, she'af heim hayu b'neis Haman. Why? Because they were also included in the miracle. So like on Hanukkah, like on Pesach, like on Purim with Megillah, if we're doing a specific mitzvah to commemorate a miracle, and that miracle impacted everyone, so then everyone is obligated to remember and connect to the miracle and to the mitzvah. So that's the first explanation why women are obligated, because they were, right, this is a man-specific requirement, and when it comes to man, women benefited just as much as men did from the miracle of the man. The Haran, the Katav Haran, the Ein Sarich. We don't need this reason of Rabbeinu Tam of Afhin Hayubo Tohanes, but rather Shebachol Maaseh Shabbos Ish ve'isha Shavin. When it comes to Shabbos, men and women are equally obligated in all aspects of Shabbos. Why is that? Because the Torah tells us about Shabbos in one place, Zachor Yom HaShabbat Lekadsho, remember Shabbos to keep it holy, and then another place it says Shamor Yom HaShabbos, observe or keep or guard Shabbos. So the rabbis teach us, the Gemara teaches us that Zachor refers to the positive commandments and Shamor to the negative commandments. The Gemara says, Kol sheyeshno b'shamor yeshno b'zachor. Whoever is obligated in Shamor, whoever is obligated to keep the negative mitzvot of Shabbos, the do nots, is thereby is equally obligated in the positive mitzvot of Shabbos, in the Zachor. So since women are obligated in the negative precepts of Shabbos, they automatically become included in the positive as well, where he's including Lechem Mishneh as a positive mitzvah of Shabbos.
Next
Everyone
page.
got that?
Got it.
Okay. So if you go back, you'll see basically everyone agrees that that women are obligated. Aruch HaShulchan in number 13. Gam nashim chayavot liftzor al shtei kikarot dechol milei Shabbos shavim nashim la'anashim. Right. So he says women are obligated because they're obligated. Like in all matters of Shabbos, men and women are equally obligated. And so therefore he goes through the procedures of who should make the bracha. Again, the assumption being made is that the Baal Habayit, the husband of the house, is going to be the one saying the bracha to fulfill everyone else's obligation. According to this, there's absolutely no reason why a woman couldn't make the bracha for men and fulfill the obligation for everyone else at the table. They're all fully equally obligated. But anyway, he goes into that discussion a little bit. The Shulchan Aruch in 14 says Nashim Chayavot b'Sudah Shlishit, women are obligated in Sudah Shlishit, and the Be'er Halacha says the Gam Chayavot b'Mitzvot Lechem Mishneh, they're also obligated in Lechem Mishneh. Right. Another interesting question is we have this requirement for Lechem Mishneh, for double portion. And again, what's the reason for Lechem Mishneh?
So you don't have to work on Shabbos.
Right. So they would gather double portion. So let's just work through the mechanics of that for a second. So it's Friday morning. You have to go, you're going to go collect your man for today and tomorrow. Okay? So you have your, how much man are you going to take?
Double what you
Double of what you're going to get. And what's that supposed to do for you?
It means that you aren't going to go out looking for food.
Right. So presumably that will give you for your Friday morning meal, right? Breakfast, lunch, whatever your first meal of the day is, and your Friday dinner. Right. So that's your Friday portion. And then you're going to have for your Shabbos lunch, we'll call it, Shabbos Kiddush, Shabbos lunch, and Sudah Shlishit. By the time you get to Sudah Shlishit, what do you have left?
You should have enough to
You
satisfy.
should have enough for Sudah Shlishit. But there's nothing extra by Sudah Shlishit time.
Right.
So would you need Lechem Mishneh for Sudah Shlishit?
Oh, only if you're going to eat it. Oh,
No, I'm
many
saying
times.
you,
I mean,
there,
many
there
times I'll
wasn't there
serve-
wasn't a, by the time you're at your last meal of Shabbos, there is no extra food being saved, right?
It's a problem with it.
I mean, you can have lechem mishneh and eat it all at Seudah Shlishi.
You could, right? So you if you didn't have a Shabbos lunch or Shabbos Kiddush, then right, you could eat a really big Sudah Shlishit. But right, meaning like the assumption is that you would be eating 2 meals a day, and right, the Kiddush on Shabbos is that there's 3 meals a day on Shabbos.
Which is the third meal?
Which is the third meal? You've played with this before, I remember.
Yeah, but I heard it from someone. Which is the third meal? And the suggestion that's made is that most people in antiquity would eat 2 meals a day during the daylight hours. They wouldn't eat after dark typically.
Right.
So there would be a morning meal, and there would be late afternoon meal.
Yeah.
And then they go to sleep.
Right.
The chiddush is to have breakfast on Friday, to have a lunch or a second meal sometime after midday, and then to have a third meal after dark. And for that,
You have to have light.
you can show off the blessing and the miracle of being able to observe Shabbos with a double portion, so to speak. That means that you are confident you're not going to have to work to collect any more food or prepare more food
Right.
the following day.
Right.
So that would imply that the Lechem Mishneh might be an option to have available for the other 2 meals on Shabbos daytime. But it's necessary for the first meal as a kind of display, a display of prosperity and confidence that you're not gonna run out of food before the end of Shabbos.
So that's interesting that the extra meal is actually the first Shabbos meal we eat.
Was it Zerizim Makdimim LeMitzvah?
Right.
People who are really sincere about doing something, they don't waste time. They do the mitzvah as soon as it comes to hand.
Right. So in source number 16, the Shulchan Aruch, just he doesn't really get into this conundrum, but he says, "Eino tzarich lekadesh b'sudah shlishit, aval tzarich livtzoa al shtei kikarot." You don't need to say kiddush at sudah shlishit, but you do need to make the blessing over 2 loaves of bread. And then Ramah adds, "Im soed harbe pamim b'Shabbat, tzarich lechol seudah shtei kikarot." If you're eating many meals, more than even the 3 Robert just explained to us, then for each meal it requires 2 loaves of bread. At the very least, when it comes to Sudah Shlishit, you should have at least 1 whole loaf. And therefore, by Sudah Shlishit, there is a common practice to only use 1 whole loaf, but it's best to be strict and to have 2 whole loaves. So there is recognition to the fact, perhaps, that on Sudah Shlishit, if we're really modeling this after the man, there is really no need for an extra loaf of bread at Sudah Shlishit if that's the final Shabbos meal. 2 more interesting issues that come up, and we'll just quickly run through them. The first is, so it's very nice that we're supposed to have 2 challahs, but as even the Shulchan Aruch here was alluding to, it's become somewhat of a formality, right? It's become like, even though there might not be reason for the 2 challahs, right? We insist to have it at Sudah Shlishit, or any extra Shabbos meals we have, you should have 2 challahs. So how symbolic is it really? And that question best comes up in the question of, can you use a frozen challah, right? So it's very common in my house that we have one nice freshly baked challah or whatever, and then, oh my gosh, we need a second one. Let's grab something out of the freezer. So does that work or not? Right? Does it have to be as we saw earlier? Is it only right to hold it when you're saying the bracha and you without any intention of eating from the second loaf, or does it have to be something that you would eat from? So the Shmirat Shabbat Kiyochata weighs in on this, and he says in number 20, Mutar litzaref lechem Mishneh lechem kafu, sharak achshav hotiu mitah hakafa. You can use frozen bread for Lechem Mishneh, even that which you just took out of the freezer now. But then in footnote 39, he quotes his Rebbe, Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, Ditachin de b'sha'asha lechem kashe ke'even v'lo ra'ui la'achila eno yachol litztaref lechem Mishneh. If it's frozen solid as a rock and it cannot be eaten at all, that can't be used for Lechem Mishneh. Below dami lematzah be'erev Pesach, right? He raises another interesting point where when Pesach begins Saturday night, so we go crazy. How do we have our Shabbos meals when we have to have Lechem Mishneh, but we're not allowed to eat matzah on erev Pesach? So a lot of people will have a roll and they'll use a matzah, just hold it nearby as their Lechem Mishneh, even though you're halachically not allowed to eat that matzah. So that would seem to be similar to the frozen loaf. He says no, because even though you're not going to eat that matzah now, that matzah still is edible in its current state. The frozen challah is not even edible. Then he adds that if you're going to eat, well, if you're going to spend a really long time at the Shabbos table, and by the end of the meal, the bread will have thawed out enough that you could eat it, so maybe that would be okay. So I think there's what to rely on to use a frozen loaf, especially if we see this really as just a symbolic reminder. And certainly if you're going to
very often.
eat long enough that it will be there, that it would thaw by the end. And then the other issue about this is, what about challah in a bag, right? So you go to the bakery, you go to Rosensdorf's, you go to Pariser's, you buy beautiful challahs for Shabbos, and you buy a little small roll for your Lechem Mishneh, right? So Friday night, you want to eat one of the beautiful challahs and you want to save the other one for tomorrow. Can you keep it in the bag so it will remain fresh, or do you have to actually take it out of the bag? So that's another very common thing, right? So so here the consensus is that you're actually supposed to have your hands on the loaf at the time, on both loaves at the time of the blessing, without anything interfering, without anything getting in the way. So leaving the challah in a plastic bag would be problematic if that's the case. You're supposed to hold the loaves together with your hands without anything in the way. I can't find the exact. Oh, is this it right here? Oh no. The Mishnah Berurah says
22.
somewhere. Is that the one with the gloves? If you're wearing gloves?
Yeah.
No, no.
That's not it.
Yeah, 21. Right. So the Mishnah Berurah says, right? You should place both your hands on the bread. It's best to do this. If you're wearing gloves, it's best to take the gloves off when saying the bracha. Maybe that was a COVID measure. I don't know why the Mishnah Berurah anyone would be wearing gloves at the time of their Shabbos meal. But anyway, you should take it off. And then one final related question, not really a Lechem Mishneh question, but certainly tangentially connected, is the question of salt. Right, so we always put salt on the challah, and the question is how necessary, or what's the basis for that. So the Shulchan Aruch in 23 says, Lo yivtza ad sheyaviu lefanav melach o liftan. You shouldn't say the bracha until they bring before you salt or relish, which Rashi says means kol davar nechalim apat, anything that you eat with bread. Could be relish, could be salsa, could be hummus, could be baba ganu, anything, right? L'lafet bo pirsa b'tzia ve'im hu, right? So that you would eat with bread in order when you first break it up. Ve'im hi nekia o shehi metuba b'tavlin o b'melach ke'in shalanu. But if the challah already is flavored to some extent, right? It's baked with salt in it or other spices. Or if your intention is to eat bread, plain bread without anything else, then there is no need to wait for salt or any other relish. So like, we go crazy to have salt on the table for Shabbos. So first of all, it's fascinating that according to this, any dip or anything that you would put on the bread would suffice. So right, those who put honey on the bread during Rosh Hashanah time, that certainly suffices. If you want to dip your challah into hummus or any other dip, that would be that would fulfill the requirements. Or if you bake, if there's salt, I think most challah recipes have salt in it these days. So if there is salt or anything or anything else, so that would suffice as well. But the Ramah does tell us mikol makom mitzvah lahavi al kol shulchan melech kodem sheyivtzoa ki hashulchan domeh lemizbeach achila lekorban. Nonetheless, it's proper to have salt on the table, even if you don't put salt on the challah. You should have salt on the table, because our table is analogous to the altar of the Beis Hamikdash, and the bread is analogous to a korban, and every korban had salt with it, brought with it. So salt becomes important not because of the bread for Shabbos, but because of this idea of elevating the table. Okay, Lechem Mishneh. Any final questions or thoughts on this?
One of the things the Torah emphasizes is that the amount that they gathered, that was always the same amount for each person.
Right.
And that is something that is mentioned in the Zohar, that it has to do with the the neshama. Every Jew has a neshama. It's all the same. And certainly the Rebbe emphasizes the essence of every Jew. This is all equal. All of this is equal. So it's interesting. We don't worry about that so much, I guess. We think of it of a certain minimal amount, which has to be something like 6 tablespoons or something like that would be like a minimal amount of challah, but we don't necessitate that dimension of it. But the story itself is so powerful that way. Joshua says that the reason for the 2 on top of each other, he gave this over one night, had to do with the dew, the 2 layers of dew above and below, and that both of them were blessings, something like that is I think what it gets to in the Kabbalah, that kind of thing.
So I was actually going to say that right, that the man was protected above and below, and so that actually might be a reason why we cover the challah. We're all familiar with the not wanting to embarrass the challah, but actually it might be to present the challah in the same way that it was found. In that case, the challah board also becomes sort of not just functional, but a necessary component of this Lechem Mishneh to remind us of the man, that there should be protection from above and below. All right, it's good to be back learning with everyone. I again apologize for the break in the schedule, and hopefully there won't be any more disruptions, and we'll meet again next week.
Oh, great.
Thank you.
All right.
That was a lovely session.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And useful.